Petawawa, jewel of Ontario. River both wild and still. White pine, white waters, and Gilly's men came for the Loon. And 100 years later, the last log drive went down. Petawawa, jewel of Ontario. River both wild and still.
Hello, I'm George Drought, and what you see behind me is the Petawawa River at the Natch. Last night we came down Railway Rapids, and then we descended the Natch Rapids and found this beautiful campsite at the bottom of the cliffs, which were made famous by Tom Thomson. This is my wife Barbara doing some grunt work just down from the headwaters where the river meanders through wonderful scenery. Barbara and I, our dog Meggie, and a few canoeing buddies are retracing a trip I've done many times as a guide and instructor, which resulted in the Petawawa Whitewater guidebook. The Petawawa, which means the noise heard far away, rises in the western highlands of Algonquin Provincial Park. There is one section at the park border that is off limits to the public.
We're standing here right now on the edge of Impact Area 7 and 8 of the training area at CP Petawawa on Montgomery Bridge and the Petawawa River as it flows through the impact area. As you can see, I'm standing beside one of the danger signs that mark the boundary of our whole training area, and we have these signs placed all over just to warn people that in fact we're on at a firing range, and they are to keep people out. There's also no trespassing signs strategically placed throughout the area. Firing going on here daily, day and night. High explosive shells, rifle ammunition, aircraft bombs up to 500 pounds are dropped in this area. And in fact, this area is quite dangerous.
We're beside Crooked Rapids at the moment, and there's a memorial here to a young soldier who died during a bridging exercise. But more significant, beside this memorial, there is Army ordnance, and by ordnance I mean expended ammunition, parachute flares, ammunition cases. So the warnings that Sean Moyles gave at the beginning of the river when we entered under Montgomery Bridge are very real indeed. With my long-time paddling companions, Peter Jaspert and Jim Poole, I received permission to run this section through the base. Only the second time I've done it. The first time was some 20 years ago with my son Richard on a trip we did from the headwaters to the Ottawa River.
Left, that's it, that's perfect. Then we'll put an angle on and drive to the right as soon as we get below here. Okay, a little bit of power, Peter. Okay, you have to get us out of here or we're going to eddy out. Okay.
Whitewater paddlers can't resist a new rapid, especially when the military knows you're here and has agreed not to shoot you.
So we're on the right side, huh? Go slowly and take a look.
At it if it looks runnable like that. Okay. Or we can stop on the island if it looks...
The Petawawa's great variety of rapids make it a favorite with canoe instructors. Here's Don Smith of Valley Ventures.
Okay, forward paddle. That's good. That's enough. Start paddling backwards, nice and gentle though. Just nice and gentle first. and I'll tell you when to beef it up a bit. Look. Okay, now. Here we go. Here we go. Here we go. Keep doing it. Keep doing it. Forward stroke. Now we'll go through these. Okay. Very good.
Just below the military base is the Petawawa at its foaming, boiling, hazardous best. Daredevil territory, and in the high waters of spring, the playground of kayakers. Oh, to be 20 again. Supervision of this vast and diverse park falls on the shoulders of John Winters. I was privileged to talk to John at one of my favorite spots, the Memorial Cross to Blair Fraser, a noted Canadian journalist who drowned here in 1968.
Well, we're working with one of the largest protected areas in eastern North America, about 7,700 square kilometers of land, water, marsh and wetland. And it's a very special place because it's home to a variety of wildlife, including moose and deer and black bear, the eastern Canadian wolf. But it's also a place that's special to Canadians and international visitors who come to this park. And there's some 10 million of them within 5 hours, George, of about where we're sitting. 10% of our visitors are coming from countries other than Canada. So our job here is both as a protector of wildlife and fishery resources, cultural heritage sites, but also we're in the tourism industry, and we're the landlords, if you like, to so many people who come from around the world to experience the same thing that we're experiencing here today.
My first trip down the Petawawa was in the early 80s, and this section from the headwaters to Cedar Lake is still not heavily traveled, despite the huge increase in the number of canoeists. We had no competition for great camping spots, just us and lots of wildlife. Jim Poole from Toronto has run this river many times. For Hugh Westheiser from Kelowna, BC, it's a first. It's a merlin, one of the 260 bird species in the park. Algonquin is a transitional area. In the east, the splendid coniferous firs and pines. In the western sections, the hardwoods. Each a home to different birds and mammals. I've never been to Algonquin when I didn't see and hear the ancient and melancholy loon, except in winter. Imagine 10,000 years on earth with a melody of cries that seemed to me the very voice of wilderness. But, despite the moose and loons, this is not a true wilderness park. It has been logged 2 or 3 times. If you look, there is evidence of human enterprise all along its banks.
Cleared for quite a way along here. It's interesting to see the regeneration of things gradually coming up, a few spruce and balsam.
It's not just the beauties of the river itself that attract me. I'm entranced by its history. Logging has been going on in Algonquin for more than a century and a half. The great white pines lasted only 70 years. Then they were gone, forever. But that era left its skeletons along the river and its banks.
Behind me is one of the buildings located here, which was part of the McLaughlin Depot Farm, which was in operation in the late 1800s, early 1900s. So this was a central location where they held their supplies so that during the winter months the men could be fed. What we have here is We have an example of the type of roof that was used in some of these logging buildings. The roof here is hollowed cedar logs. And what was done was they were overlapped from each other, and then another one underneath this would be cupped up. When the rain came, it would run off these top logs into the troughs and down off to the end of the roof.
At the end of the day, after good food around a campfire, I appreciate canoeing as a three-dimensional experience of body, mind, and spirit. The old logging era with men living in camps all winter ended with the coming of the railway, trucks, and the extensive building of roads. In fact, the last spring river drive was in 1959, right here on the Petawawa. But the ghosts, the memories, the bits and pieces of lives gone by remain for the pondering.
We're on a campsite in Burnt Lake, and this anchor was probably from the alligator at the Barnett Depot at the south end of the lake, and the alligators were used to tow the log booms across the lakes. Pretty massive stuff. There's a huge pulley over here that was probably part of the winching system that was used to tow the alligators across land to pick up the boom after it had crossed the flumes to the other side.
Towards the end of our first week, we'd gone only as far as Catfish Lake. The weather was fabulous, the challenges were small, the company excellent, no big rapids, just a little ledge or two through old, decaying dams. Stack's Rapids, the bane of the loggers, and today the bane of canoeists. For loggers, the way around Stack's 2.5 kilometers, with 4 or 5 major drops, was the chute. The succession of chutes at the Stacks now survive only in photos. Not surprisingly, it is a brutal portage past them to Cedar Lake. Once you hit Brent on Cedar Lake, you meet the folks who lived the history.
I was raised in the park. My mother was born on Bruley Lake and taught me school all my younger years at Cass Lake. My father was in the park all his life as a ranger. My grandfather on his side was a cook for J.R. Booth, and my grandfather on my mother's side was he was an accountant for one of the big McLaughlin Lumber Company, and then became chief ranger for the Department of Lands and Forests. The Stacks Rapids are quite famous around here because somehow people don't believe that they're dangerous, and everybody attempts them. Very few people make it through without some damage. The portage takes 45 minutes. The river takes minimum of 7 hours with much danger. For a good whitewater person, it still takes a lot of caution. I fish it all the time. I walk up and down it. I've had numerous rescues in there, broken legs, cuts, bruises, broken canoes, many disasters.
Jake, a couple of years ago when we were paddling Rollway, we stopped partway down and I felt something roll under my feet and I picked up one of these. Can you tell me how this might have been used in the logging industry?
This is what was called a peavey, and they're quite long handled, and they were for rolling logs out into the water, so they'd be carried downstream. The peavy's a little different than a cant hook. Cant hook has a hook here, but which would be very dangerous for loggers because it would get hooked on the log and take the logger with them. So these peavies just had a pike to push with and a hook to roll with.
Wow.
And you find them all along the river here because when the log took off and they didn't want to go with it, they just let go.
So my poor guy, my handle I think was broken about here, so my poor guy might have snapped off into the cold water, or...
Probably. There's lots of graves along the side of the Petawawa.
Okay, don't let us hit a rock.
We just get over there.
Make a move.
And
I'll follow you.
Over.
I can't see.
Okay, sorry.
When I was a young fella, I used to come down here lots on the Petawawa River here, and just behind me was the old logging dam. It was built out of logs. It had a sluway in the middle to let the logs through whenever they were making a drive down the river. I'm not sure which year it went out, but I believe it was probably in the mid-60s. And then I believe in the spring when it did let go, it probably got a big bunch of ice came up against it and just forced it right out of the river. When that happened, the lake actually was very low. Public Works came in. They built an overflow dam like behind me. It only lasted the 1 year. It let go, so they had to come back, and this is the second overflow dam that they put in this spot where the old original lumber dam was at one time.
Is that about where you want us, George? In this?
That's great.
I'm just looking at the first map in George's book. It's actually map 2 of the rapids just below the dam, and the gradient here in high water is grade 3, and we're looking at a grade 2 rapids, and it'll be a technical run for us, and we have to get the canoes over top of the dam, which should be no problem, taking an empty canoe down, and the first 100 meters or so is a fairly steep drop into a pool. It's not really a pool in the true sense of the word, but it's a quieter bit of water where we'll load the canoes up, and then there's some interesting looking rapids below that. And the other thing that I noticed, that there's more water in the river here.
Okay, ready to turn?
Yeah. Okay, good. Forgot where we're going. There we are.
There's a good
Straight
line
ahead.
there. Just left or right of the nose.
Okay?
Yep.
Okay. Okay. Heavy.
Okay, up the middle here. Good. Okay, we're going down that chute. Up.
We were often given pause to reflect that while the rapids were great fun for us, they were, for too many, a matter of life or death.
In memoriam, in this enclosure are buried the bodies of more than 20 rivermen drowned in the nearby waters before 1916, when the railroad was completed. To designate this spot as a final resting place, this tablet is placed here in loving memory of Flying Officer Donald Mervyn Eastman, RCAF, killed overseas 9th of June 1945.
Down in the bottom end of Radiant Lake where the Petawawa goes out.
Yes.
Just before you get there used to be a graveyard on the right-hand side.
Exactly. Right on. And I found that graveyard. Yeah. Oh, yes. I've been there. Oh, yes. Yeah. And you know, the little trees were starting to grow at that time in the graveyard.
Really?
Yeah. We were just, about half a mile from that graveyard. That's where we were. That's where the Bunsen Company had their, their camp, eh? And we were camped on Radiant Lake, but they had the company had a camp in on Little Madawaska, eh? 12 miles in.
Mm-hmm.
I worked there for a while till we got, some of the logs cut, and then we drove them down in the spring of the year. And then they loaded them there on Radiant Lake.
You used to collect the logs on Radiant Lake?
On Radiant Lake, where they'd come out at the Madawaska, and we'd tow them down to the where they loaded them, about 2 miles down the lake.
How'd you do the towing?
With that little alligator.
Now, you must have some stories about it. Did you ever have accidents or funny times or?
Well, one time I pretty near got drowned. It was a real windy day, and they couldn't straighten the logs. So we hooked onto the boom and hauled it out so it would break the waves. And so it was dinner time. And I said to the engineer, I said, I'm going to swim out there and get a little boat and come and pick you up and go for dinner. I used to be able to swim pretty good. And he said, okay, it'll save us pulling the anchor up. And so I jumped in and started swimming for shore, and the waves went right over my head. And I'd forgot to take my big boots off. And I was starting to get out of wind. And I put everything I had in me to reach shore. And I was so weak after, I'll never forget it. Yeah, I come pretty close that time. That was the only time, yeah.
Although we were traveling in July, when the weather was day after day of glorious sunshine and too hot for mosquitoes and flies, but not for squirrels, we never had trouble finding lovely campsites like this one on Francis Lake. The next day we took a little side trip up the Crow River to see Crow River Falls. it wasn't the only fall that put on a show. From Crow River downstream to Lake Travers is probably the toughest section of the Petawawa. That's because of rapids like Wagtail and McDonald. While McDonald can be run summer in low or medium water conditions, some parts of it must be lined. Not always a simple matter. Lining requires as much skill as running Whitewater. To get to the portage around Bypass Falls, one paddles through a canyon of stunning beauty. Stridey cliffs, magnificent forest, calm waters. Devil's Cellar is a portage for all but the foolhardy. We didn't run it, but we did enjoy the view. At the end of this portage, while we had lunch, we studied the map and worked out how to approach the temptations. We agreed to run the canoes empty and portage our gear. The Temptations, which I was privileged to name, are a challenging series of 6 ledges. Your approach must be right on. I named the first one Beelzebub, a vicious whirlpool that ends in a very powerful eddy. Staying out of it takes power and finesse. If you are drawn in, getting out is just as formidable.
I think the most exciting part of the trip for me was coming down Devil's Chute, where we ended up dumping, but talk about exhilaration. The Temptations were incredible. Coming down that today was just unbelievable. I can't put it into words because there's just so many different parts of it that I like. There's the peaceful, slowly paddling down the lazy river with the sun and the birds and the scenery, and then there's the excitement of somebody turning the canoe and being in rapid water where you have to throw ropes to them and try to get them out, and there's not a panic, but there's action and there's an intense part of the trip then. And, you know, getting out and scouting the rapids where you plotting a course and you're trying to decide how you're going to technically get through them, and then it's okay, let's try it. And you get in the boats and off you go and you try to do what you planned on. Sometimes it goes exactly according to plan, and other times you're right off the plan from the get-go.
The last leg, Lake Trevere to Lake McManus. This is the most popular section of the Petawawa for a number of reasons. It has several exciting rapids, and there is an easy shuttle access. It can also be done in a very nice weekend trip.
The ranger crews keep these portage trails in good condition. It's nice to see the areas where they've been able to put in bridges and plankways where it's very wet in the spring and wet conditions.
From this bay, it's quite easy to do a peel out and head for the main tongue. And I don't think any of these little ledges or rocks going down to that main tongue are particularly difficult to avoid.
Now this is the really critical point, okay? Once you're through this chute, you've got to get your line up to make that big eddy on the left.
How do you suggest running this, you know, out of this tongue right here?
You're going to make sure that your stern is out, you drive in, take the eddy on the left. You are going to come out of the eddy, okay, eddy into the current, and you'll see a tongue that goes through the center of that ledge, okay? There's a wet rock, pillow rock there that you're going to keep on your left, through the tongue, through the next steeper tongue.
Larry Weller is an interior park warden. His job is patrolling the campsites and areas of the northern region of Algonquin. So Larry, how long have you been a warden on this river?
I've been here for about 21 years, but the end of this season.
So in fact, you started on this river a year before I came down with my son through the full length of the river, which was 81.
Yeah, 1981 is actually, is when I started. Yeah.
Same year?
Yeah, same year actually, yeah.
Wow.
Out of Stonecliff when the north end was still between north and south, and that was our base of operations.
21 years. You must have seen some interesting things.
There was an incident a few years ago where on one of our patrols, again in high water in the spring, we found a busted cedar strip canoe down below at the cedar, near the cabin, in the pool by the cabin there. And we had no idea, we had no reports, and anyway, about 4 months later, we were back on this river looking for some people, ran into a couple of guys down in the Natch, happened to be from Newfoundland, and we mentioned about the river and, you know, the trouble with rapids and the need for safety and the high water in the spring here, and we mentioned this busted cedar strip canoe, who could possibly have come through, and they said we were the guys. And it was high water. They told us it was high water. They came down through. One guy got out to take pictures. The other guy decided he was going to do it. There's, as you know, there's a giant curler wave at the bottom, right in the chute there. Yeah. They went through. The way the man described it is it took him up, flipped him over, took him down underneath, kept him there, spit him back up, and then took him back down again. And his comment was, "What a rush."
After our rush, running the Thompsons, the perfect campsite is this one at Crooked Chute. Peaceful, with interesting visitors. Busy wildlife. Algonquin Supervisor of Operations North, Peter Dawson, recounts the cabin's history.
This is the Crooked Chute cabin on the Petawawa River. It's a historic cabin dating back to 1927 when it was first built to accommodate park rangers on their patrols. The original one had to be essentially torn down, but we endeavored to keep the original size and location, and we have built this replica on site here, just over from where the original cabin was.
The cabin, which can be rented, is a great place to spend a day or two before the challenges of rollway rapids and the Natch. The last lap to our last night's campsite. Well, we've had a good meal this evening, and it's 20 years since I came down this river, and I just wanted to tell you a small story about this coffee pot. When Richard and I started off at Daisy Lake, we had no coffee pot. We were boiling coffee in a saucepan. And we finally arrived in Brent a week later, probably with less ordeal than we did on this particular trip, because they didn't have all the barrels, at least we didn't have all the barrels and everything else. And I walked into the store at Brent, and I think it was the first year that Jake Pigeon had taken it over with Algonquin Outfitters. And I saw this old second-hand coffee pot hanging on a hook. And you know what the store is like at Cedar Lake. And I just fell in love with it. And believe it or not, it has been with me on every single trip I've ever done anywhere for 20 years. And it's still hanging in.
Many a cup of coffee drank from it.
Whoa, land at last after many days of ocean pain.
Petawawa, jewel of Ontario. River both wild and still. White pine, white waters, and Gilly's men